Casti Connubii, Part 3. Whence it comes about, not unfrequently, as experience shows, that deplorable defections from religion occur among the offspring, or at least a headlong descent into that religious indifference which is closely allied to impiety. There is this also to be considered, that in these mixed marriages it becomes much more difficult to imitate by a lively conformity of spirit the mystery of which we have spoken, namely that close union between Christ and his Church. Assuredly, also, there will be wanting that close union of spirit, which as it is the sign and mark of the Church of Christ, so also should be the sign of Christian wedlock, its glory and adornment. For, where there exists diversity of mind, truth, and feeling, the bond of union of mind and heart is wont to be broken, or at least weakened. From this comes the danger lest the love of man and wife grow cold, and the peace and happiness of family life, resting as it does on the union of hearts, be destroyed. Many centuries ago, indeed, the old Roman law had proclaimed, "Marriages are the union of male and female, a sharing of life and the communication of divine and human rights." But especially, as we have pointed out, venerable brethren, the deity of divorce is an obstacle to the restoration of marriage to that state of perfection which the divine Redeemer willed it should possess. Advocates of neo-paganism of today have learned nothing from the sad state of affairs, but instead, day by day, more and more vehemently, they continue by legislation to attack the indissolubility of the marriage bond, proclaiming that the lawfulness of divorce must be recognized, and that the antiquated laws should give place to a new and more humane legislation. Many and varied are the grounds put forward for divorce, some arising from the wickedness and the guilt of the persons concerned, others arising from the circumstances of the case. The former they describe as subjective, the latter as objective. In a word, whatever might make married life hard or unpleasant. They strive to prove their contentions regarding these grounds for the divorce legislation they would bring about by various arguments. Thus, in the first place, they maintain that it is for the good of either party that one who is innocent should have the right to separate from the guilty, or that the guilty should be withdrawn from a union which is unpleasing to him and against his will. In the second place, they argue, the good of the child demands this, for either it will be deprived of a proper education or the natural fruits of it, and will too easily be affected by the discords and shortcomings of the parents, drawn from the path of virtue. And thirdly, the common good of society requires that these marriages should be completely dissolved, which are now incapable of producing their natural results, and that legal reparation should be allowed when crimes are to be feared as the result of the common habitation and intercourse of the parties. This view, they say, must be admitted to avoid the crimes being committed purposely with a view to obtaining the desired sentence of divorce, for which the judge can legally loose the marriage bond, as also to prevent people from coming before the courts when it is obvious from the state of the case that they are lying and perjuring themselves. all of which brings the court and the lawful authority into contempt. Hence the civil laws, in their opinion, have to be reformed to meet these new requirements, to suit the changes of the times and the changes in men's opinions, civil institutions, and customs. Each of these reasons is considered by them as conclusive, so that all taken together offer a clear proof of the necessity of granting divorce in certain cases. Others, taking a step further, simply state that marriage, being a private contract, is, like other private contracts, to be left to the consent and good pleasure of both parties, and so can be dissolved for any reason whatsoever. Opposed to all these reckless opinions, venerable brethren, stands the unalterable law of God, fully confirmed by Christ, a law that can never be deprived of its force by the decrees of men, the ideas of a people, or the will of any legislator. What God hath joined together, let no man put asunder. And if any man, acting contrary to this law, shall have put asunder, his action is null and void, and the consequence remains, as Christ himself has explicitly confirmed. Every one that putteth away his wife and marrieth another, committeth adultery. And he that marrieth her that is put away from her husband, committeth adultery. Moreover, these words refer to a kind of marriage, even that which is natural and legitimate only. For, as has already been observed, that indissolubility by which the loosening of the bond is once and for all removed from the whim of the parties and from every secular power, is a property of every true marriage. Let that solemn pronouncement of the Council of Trent be recalled to mind, in which, under the stigma of anathema, it condemned these errors. If anyone should say that on account of heresy or the hardships of cohabitation, or deliberate abuse of one party by the other, the marriage tie may be loosened, let him be anathema. And again, if anyone should say that the Church errs in having taught or in teaching that, according to the teaching of the Gospels and the Apostles, the bond of marriage cannot be loosed because the sin of adultery of either party, or that neither party, even though he be innocent, having given no cause for the sin of adultery, can contract another marriage during the lifetime of the other, and that he commits adultery who marries another after putting away his adulterous wife, and likewise that she commits adultery who puts away her husband and marries another. Let him be anathema. If therefore the Church has not erred, and does not err in teaching this, and consequently it is certain that the bond of marriage cannot be loosed even on account of the sin of adultery, it is evident that all other weaker excuses that can be, and are usually brought forward, are of no value whatsoever. And the objections brought against the firmness of the marriage bond are easily answered. For, in certain circumstances, imperfect separation of the parties is allowed, the bond not being severed. This separation, which the Church herself permits, and expressly mentions in her canon law, in those canons would deal with the separation of the parties as to the marital relationship and cohabitation, removes all the alleged inconveniences and dangers. It will be for the sacred law, and, to some extent, also the civil law, in so far as civil matters are affected, to lay down the grounds, the conditions, the method and precautions to be taken in a case of this kind in order to safeguard the education of the children and of the well-being of the family, and to remove all those evils which threaten the married persons, the children of the state. Now all those arguments that are to be brought forward to prove the indissolubility of marriage, arguments that have already been touched upon, can equally be applied to excluding not only the necessity of divorce, but even the power to grant it, while for all the advantages that can be put forward for the former, there can be adduced as many disadvantages and evils which are a formidable menace to the whole of society. To revert again to the expression of our predecessor, it is hardly necessary to point out what an amount of good is involved in the absolute indissolubility of wedlock, and what a train of evils follow upon divorce. Whenever the marriage bond remains intact, then we find marriage is contracted with a sense of safety and security, while, when separations are considered and the dangers of divorce are present, the marriage contract itself becomes insecure, or at least gives ground for anxiety and surprises. On the one hand, we see a wonderful strengthening of goodwill and cooperation in the daily life of husband and wife, while, on the other, both of these are miserably weakened by the presence of a facility for divorce. Here we have at the very opportune moment a source of help by which both parties are enabled to preserve their purity and loyalty. There we find harmful inducements to unfaithfulness. On this side we find the birth of children and their tuition and upbringing effectively promoted. Many avenues of discord closed among the families and relations, and the beginnings of rivalry and jealousy easily suppressed. On that, very great obstacles to the birth and rearing of children and their education, and many occasions of quarrels, and seeds of jealousy sown everywhere. Finally, but especially, the dignity and position of women in civil and domestic society is reinstated by the former, while by the latter it is shamefully lowered, and the danger is incurred of their being considered outcasts, slaves of the lust of men. To conclude with the most important words of Leo XIII, since the destruction of family life and the loss of national wealth is brought about more by the corruption of morals than anything else, it is easily seen that divorce, which is born of the perverted morals of a people, and leads, as experiment shows, to vicious habits in public and private life, is particularly opposed to the well-being of the family and of the state. The serious nature of these evils will be even more clearly recognized when we remember that, once divorce has been allowed, there will be no sufficient means of keeping it in check within any definite bounds. Great is the force of example, greater still that of lust, and with such incitements it cannot but happen that divorce and its consequent setting loose of the passions should spread daily and attack the souls of many like a contagious disease, or a river bursting its banks and flooding the land. Thus, as we read in the same letter, unless things change, the human family and the state have every reason to fear lest they should suffer absolute ruin. All this was written 50 years ago, yet it is confirmed by the daily increasing corruption of morals and the unheard-of degradation of the family in those lands where communism reigns unchecked. Thus far, venerable brethren, we have admired with due reverence all that wise Creator and Redeemer of the human race has ordained with regard to human marriage. And at the same time we have expressed our grief that such a pious ordinance of the divine goodness should today, on every side, be frustrated and trampled upon by the passions and errors and vices of men. It is then fitting that, with all fatherly solicitude, we should turn our mind to seek out suitable remedies whereby these most detestable abuses which we have mentioned may be removed, and everywhere marriage may again be revealed. To this end, it behooves us, above all else, to call to mind that firmly established principle, esteemed alike in sound philosophy and sacred theology, namely, that whatever things have deviated from their right order cannot be brought back to that original state which is in harmony with their nature, except by a return to the divine plan which, as the angelic doctor teaches, is the exemplar of all right order. Wherefore, our predecessor of happy memory, Leo XIII, attacked the doctrine of the naturalists with these words: "It is a divinely appointed law that whatsoever things are constituted by God, the author of nature, these we find the more useful and salutary, the more they remain in their natural state, unimpaired and unchanged, inasmuch as God, the Creator of all things, intimately knows what is suited to the constitution and the preservation of each, and by his will and mind has so ordained all this that each may duly achieve its purpose. But if the boldness and wickedness of men change and disturb this order of things, so providentially disposed, then indeed things so wonderfully ordained will begin to be injurious, or will cease to be beneficial, either because in the change they have lost their power to benefit, or because God himself is thus pleased to draw down chastisement on the pride and presumption of men. In order, therefore, to restore due order in this matter of marriage, it is necessary that all should bear in mind what is the divine plan and strive to conform to it. Wherefore, since the chief obstacle to this study is the power of unbridled lust, which indeed is the most potent cause of sinning against the sacred laws of matrimony, and since man cannot hold in check his passions, unless he first subject himself to God, this must be his primary endeavor, in accordance with the plan divinely ordained. For it is a sacred ordinance that whosoever shall have first subjected himself to God will, by the aid of divine grace, be glad to subject to himself his own passions and concupiscence, while he who is a rebel against God will, to his sorrow, experience within himself the violent rebellion of his worst passions. And how wisely this has been decreed! St. Augustine thus shows, "This indeed is fitting, that the lower be subject to the higher, so that he would have subject to himself whatever is below him, should himself submit to whatever is above him. Acknowledge order, seek peace. Be thou subject to God, and thy flesh subject to thee." What more fitting? What more fair? Thou art subject to the higher, and the lower is subject to thee. Do thou serve him who made thee, so that that which was made for thee may serve thee? For we do not commend this order, namely, the flesh to thee and thou to God, but thou to God and the flesh to thee. If, however, thou despisest the subjection of thyself to God, thou shalt never bring about the subjection of the flesh to thyself. If thou dost not obey the Lord, thou shalt be tormented by thy servant. This right ordering on the part of God's wisdom is mentioned by the holy doctor of the Gentiles, inspired by the Holy Spirit. For in speaking of those ancient philosophers who refused to adore and reverence him, whom they knew to be the creator of the universe, he says, "Wherefore God gave them up to the desires of their heart, unto uncleanness, to dishonor their own bodies amongst themselves." And again, "For this same God delivered them up to shameful affections." And St. James says, "God resisteth the proud, and giveth grace to the humble." Without which grace, as the same doctor of the Gentiles reminds us, man cannot subdue the rebellion of his flesh. Consequently, as the onslaughts of these uncontrolled passions cannot in any way be lessened, unless the spirit first shows a humble compliance of duty and reverence towards its Maker, it is above all and before all needful that those who are joined in the bond of sacred wedlock should be wholly imbued with a profound and genuine sense of duty towards God, which will shape their whole lives, and fill their minds and wills with a very deep reverence for the majesty of God. Quite fittingly, therefore, and quite in accordance with the defined norm of Christian sentiment, do those pastors of souls act to prevent married people from falling in their observance of God's law, urge them to perform their duty and exercise their religion so that they should give themselves to God, continually ask for his divine assistance, frequent the sacraments, and always nourish and preserve a loyal and thoroughly sincere devotion to God. They are greatly deceived who, having underestimated or neglected these means which rise above nature, think that they can induce men by the use and discovery of the natural sciences, such as those of biology, the science of heredity, and the like, to curb their carnal desires. We do not say this in order to belittle those natural means which are not dishonest, for God is the author of nature as well as of grace, and he has disposed the good things of both orders for the beneficial use of men. The faithful, therefore, can and ought to be assisted also by natural means. But they are mistaken who think that these means are able to establish chastity in the nuptial union, or that they are more effective than supernatural grace. This conformity of wedlock and moral conduct with the divine laws respective of marriage, without which its effective restoration cannot be brought about, supposes, however, that all can discern readily, with real certainty, and without any accompanying error, what those laws are. But everyone can see how many fallacies an avenue would be opened up, and how many errors would become mixed with the truth, if it were left solely to the light of reason of each to find it out, or if it were discovered by the private interpretation of the truth which is revealed. And if this is applicable to many other truths of the moral order, we must all the more pay attention to those things which appertain to marriage, and which the ordinary desire for pleasure can attack frail human nature, and easily deceive it and lead it astray. This is all the more true of the observance of natural law, which demands sometimes hard and repeated sacrifices, for which, as experience points out, a weak man can find so many excuses for avoiding the fulfillment of the divine law. This conformity of wedlock in moral conduct with the divine laws respective of marriage, without which its effective restoration cannot be brought about, supposes, however, that all can discern readily, with real certainty, and without any accompanying error, what those laws are. But everyone can see to how many fallacies an avenue would open up, and how many errors would become mixed with the truth, if it were left solely to the light of reason of each to find it out, or if there were to be discovered by the private interpretation of the truth which is revealed. And if this is applicable to many other truths of the moral order, we must all the more pay attention to those things which appertain to marriage, where the inordinate desire for pleasure can attack frail human nature, and easily deceive it and lead it astray. This is all the more of the observance of the divine law, which demands sometimes hard and repeated sacrifices, for which, as experience points out, a weak man can find so many excuses for avoiding the fulfillment of the divine law. On this account, in order that no falsification or corruption of the divine law, but a true, genuine knowledge of it may enlighten the minds of men and guide their conduct, it is necessary that a filial and humble obedience towards the Church should be combined with such devotion to God that the desire of submitting to him. For Christ himself made the Church the teacher of truth in those things which concern the right regulation of moral conduct, even though some knowledge of the same is not beyond human reason. For just as God, in the case of natural truths of religion and morals, added revelation to the light of reason, so that what is right and true in the present state also of the human race may be known readily with real certainty without any admixture of error. So for the same purpose he had constituted the Church the guardian and the teacher of the whole of the truth concerning religion and moral conduct. To her, therefore, should be faithful, show obedience, and subject their minds and hearts so as to be kept unharmed and free from error and moral corruption, so that they shall not deprive themselves of that assistance given by God with such liberal bounty. They ought to show this due obedience not only when the Church defines something with solemn judgment, but also, in proper proportion, when by the constitutions and decrees of the Holy See, opinions are prescribed and condemned as dangerous or distorted. Wherefore, let the faithful also be on their guard against the overrated independence of private judgment, and that false autonomy of human reason. For it is quite foreign to anybody, bearing the name of a Christian, to trust his own mental powers with such pride as to agree only with those things which he can examine from their inner nature, and to imagine that the Church, sent by God to teach and guide all nations, is not conversant with present affairs and circumstances, or even that they must obey only in those manners which she had decreed by solemn definition, as though her other decisions might be presumed to be false, or putting forward insufficient motive for truth and honesty. Quite the contrary, the characteristic of the true followers of Christ, lettered or unlettered, is to suffer themselves to be guided and led in all things that touch upon faith or morals by the Holy Church of God through its supreme pastor, the Roman pontiff, who is himself guided by Jesus Christ our Lord. Consequently, since everything must be referred to the law and mind of God, in order to bring about the universal and permanent restoration of marriage, it is indeed of the utmost importance that the faithful should be well instructed concerning matrimony, both by word of mouth and by the written word, not cursorily, but often and fully, by means of plain and weighty arguments, so that these truths will strike the intellect and will be deeply engraved on their hearts. Let them realize and diligently reflect upon the great wisdom, kind, and bounty God has shown towards the human race, not only by the institution of marriage, but also, and quite as much, by upholding it with sacred laws, still more, in wonderfully raising it to the dignity of a sacrament by which such an abundant fountain of graces have been opened to those who are joined in Christian wedlock, that there may be able to serve the noble purposes of wedlock for their own welfare and for that of their children, of the community, and also for that of human relationship. Certainly, if the latter-day subverters of marriage are entirely devoted to misleading the minds of men and corrupting their hearts, to making a mockery of matrimonial purity, and extolling the filthiest of vices by means of books and pamphlets and other innumerable methods, much more ought you, venerable brethren, whom the Holy Ghost has placed as bishops to rule the Church of God, which he hath purchased with his own blood, to give yourselves wholly to this, that through yourselves and through the priests subject to you, and, moreover, throughout the laity welded together by Catholic action, so much desired and recommended by us, into a power of hierarchical apostolate, you may, by every fitting means, oppose error by truth, vice by the excellent dignity of chastity, the slavery of covetousness by the liberty of the sons of God, that disastrous ease in obtaining divorce by an enduring love in the bond of marriage, and by the inviolate pledge of fidelity given even to death. Thus it will come to pass that the faithful will wholeheartedly thank God that they are bound together by his command, and led by gentle compulsion to fly as far as possible from every kind of idolatry of the flesh, and from the base slavery of the passions. They will, in a great measure, turn and be turned away from these abominable opinions, which to the dishonor of man's dignity are now spread about in speech and in writing, and collected under the title of perfect marriage, and which indeed would make that perfect marriage nothing better than depraved marriage, as it has been rightly and truly called. Such wholesome instruction and religious training in regards to Christian marriage will be quite different from the exaggerated physiological education by means of which, in these times of ours, some reformers of married life make pretense of helping those joined in wedlock, laying much stress on these physiological matters, in which is learned rather the art of sinning in a subtle way than the virtue of living chastely. So, venerable brethren, we make entirely our own the words which our predecessor of happy memory, Leo XIII, in his encyclical letter on Christian marriage, addressed to the bishops of the whole world. Take care not to spare your efforts and authority in bringing about that among the people committed to your guidance, that doctrine may be preserved whole and unadulterated, which Christ the Lord and the apostles, the interpreters of the divine will, have handed down, and which the Catholic Church herself has religiously preserved, and commanded to be observed by the faithful of every age. Even the very best introduction given by the Church, however, will not alone suffice to bring about once more conformity of marriage to the law of God. Something more is needed in addition to the education of the mind, namely a steadfast determination of the will, on the part of husband and wife, to observe the sacred laws of God and of nature in regard to marriage. In fine, in spite of what others may wish to assert and spread abroad by word of mouth or in writing, let husband and wife resolve to stand fast to the commandments of God in all things that matrimony demands, always to render to each other the assistance of mutual love, to honor and preserve chastity, not to lay profane hands on the stable nature of the bond, to use the rights given them by marriage in a way that should always be Christian and sacred, more especially in the first years of wedlock, so that should there be need of continency afterwards, custom will have made it easier for each to preserve it. In each that they may make this firm resolution, and keep it and practice it, an oft-repeated consideration of their state of life, and a diligent reflection on the sacrament they have received, will be of great assistance to them. Let them constantly keep in mind that they have been sanctified and strengthened for the duties and for the dignity of their state by a special treatment, the efficacious power of which, although it does not impress a character, is undying. To this purpose we may ponder over the words full of real comfort by the holy Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, who, with other well-known theologians with devout conviction, thus expresses himself. The sacrament of matrimony can be regarded in two ways. First, in the making, and then its permanent state. For it is a sacrament like that of the Eucharist, which not only when it is being conferred, but also whilst it remained, is a sacrament, for as long as the married parties are alive, so long is their union a sacrament of Christ and the Church. Yet in order that the grace of this sacrament may produce its full fruit, there is need, as we have already pointed out, of the cooperation of the married parties, which consists in their full striving to fulfill their duties to the best of their ability, with unwearied effort. For just as in the natural order men must apply the powers given them by God with their own toil and diligence, that these may exercise the full vigor, failing which no profit is gained, so also men must diligently and unceasingly use the powers given them by the grace which is laid up in the soul by this sacrament. Let not, then, those who are joined in matrimony neglect the grace of the sacrament which is in them, for, in applying themselves to the careful observance, however laborious, of their duties, they will find the power of that grace becoming more effectual as time goes on. And if ever they should feel themselves to be overburdened by the hardships of their condition of life, let them not lose courage, but rather let them regard in some measure as addressed to them that which Paul the Apostle wrote to his beloved disciple Timothy regarding the sacrament of holy orders, when the disciple was dejected through hardship and insults. I admonish thee that thou stir up the grace which is in thee by the imposition of my hands. For God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power, and of love and sobriety. All these things, however, venerable brethren, depend in large measure on the due preparation of remote and proximate of the parties of marriage. For it cannot be denied that the basis of a happy wedlock, and the ruin of an unhappy one, is prepared and set in the souls of boys and girls during the period of childhood and adolescence. There is danger that those who before marriage sought in all things what is theirs, who indulged even their impure desires, will be in the married state what they were before, that they will reap that which they have sown. Indeed, within the home there will be sadness, lamentation, mutual contempt, strifes, estrangements, weariness of common life, and, worst of all, such parties will find themselves left alone with their own unconquered passions. Let then those who are about to enter on married life approach that state well disposed and well prepared, so that they will be able, as far as they can, to help each other in sustaining the vicissitudes of life, yet more in attending to their eternal salvation, and in forming the inner man unto the fullness of the age of Christ. It will also help them, if they behave towards their cherished offspring as God wills, that is, that the father be truly a father, and the mother truly a mother, through their devout love and unwearying care. The home, though it suffer the want and hardship of this valley of tears, may become for the children of its own way a foretaste of that paradise of delight in which the Creator placed the first men of the human race. Thus they will be able to bring up their children as perfect men and perfect Christians. They will instill into them a sound understanding of the Catholic Church, and will give them such disposition and love for their fatherland as duty and gratitude demand. Consequently, both those who are now thinking of entering upon this sacred married state, as well as those who have had the charge of educating Christian youth, should, with due regard to the future, prepare that which is good, obviate that which is bad, and recall those points about which we have already spoken in our encyclical letter concerning children and their education. The inclination of the will, if they are bad, must be repressed from childhood, but such as are good must be fostered, and the mind, particularly of children, should be imbued with doctrines which begin with God, while the heart should be strengthened with the aids of divine grace, in the absence of which no one can curb evil desires, nor can his discipline and formation be brought to complete perfection by the Church. For Christ has provided her with heavenly doctrines and divine sacraments, that he might make her an effectual leader of men. To the proximate preparation of a good married life belongs very specially the care in choosing a partner. On that depends a great deal whether the forthcoming marriage will be happy or not, since one may be to the other either a great help in leading a Christian life, or a great danger and hindrance, and so that they may not deplore for the rest of their lives the sorrows arising from indiscreet marriage, those about to enter into wedlock should carefully deliberate in choosing the person in whom henceforward they must live continually. They should, in so debilitating, keep before their minds the first of God and of the true religion of Christ, then of themselves, of their partner, of the children to come, and also of human and civil society, for which wedlock is the fountainhead. Let them diligently pray for divine help, so that they make their choice in accordance with Christian prudence, not indeed led by the blind and unrestrained impulse of lust, nor by any desire of riches or other base influence, but by a true and noble love, and by a sincere affection for the future partner. And then let them strive in their married life for those ends which the state was constituted by God. Lastly, let them not omit to ask the prudent advice of their parents with regard to the partner. Let them regard this advice in no light manner, in order that their mature knowledge and experience of human affairs they may guard against a disastrous choice, and, on the threshold of matrimony, may receive more abundantly the divine blessing of the fourth commandment, honor thy father and thy mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, that it may be well for thee, and thou mayest be long-lived upon the earth. Now, since it is no rare thing to find that the perfect observance of God's commands and conjugal integrity encounter difficulties by reason of the fact that the man and wife are in straitened circumstances, their necessities must be relieved as far as possible. And so, in the first place, let effort be made to bring about that which our predecessor, Leo XIII, of happy memory, has already insisted upon, namely, that in the state such economic and social methods should be adopted as will enable every head of a family to earn as much as, according to his station in life, is necessary for himself, his wife, and for the rearing of his children, for the laborer is worthy of his hire. To deny this, or to make light of what is equitable, is a grave injustice, and is placed among the greatest sins by Holy Writ. Nor is it lawful to fix such a scanty wage as will be insufficient for the upkeep of the family in the circumstances in which it is placed. Care, however, must be taken that the parties themselves, for a considerable time before entering upon married life, should strive to dispose of, or at least to diminish, the material obstacles in their way. The manner in which this is to be done effectively and honestly must be pointed out by those who are experienced. Provision must be made also, in the case of those who are not self-supporting, for joint aid by private or public guilds. When these means which we have pointed out do not fulfill the needs, particularly of a larger or poorer family, Christian charity towards our neighbor absolutely demands that those things which are lacking to the needy should be provided. Hence it is incumbent on the rich to help the poor, so that, having an abundance of this world's goods, they may not expend them fruitlessly or completely squander them, but employ them for the support and well-being of those who lack the necessities of life. They who give their substance to Christ, in the person of his poor will, receive from the Lord a most bountiful reward when he shall come to judge the world. They who act to the contrary will pay the penalty. Not in vain does the Apostle warn us, "He that hath the substance of this world, and shall see his brother in need, and shall shut up his bowels from him, how doth the charity of God abide in him?" If, however, for this purpose, private resources do not suffice, it is the duty of the public authority to supply for the insufficient forces of individual effort, particularly in a matter which is of such importance to the common weal, touching as it does the maintenance of the family and married couples. If families, particularly those in which there are many children, have not suitable dwellings, if the husband cannot find employment and means of livelihood, if the necessities of life cannot be purchased except at exorbitant prices, if even the mother of the family, to the great harm of the home, is expected to go forth and seek a living by her own labor, if she, too, in the ordinary or even extraordinary labors of childbirth, is deprived of proper food, medicine, and the assistance of a skilled physician, it is patent to all to what an extent married people may lose heart, and how home life and the observance of God's commands are rendered difficult for them. Indeed, it is obvious how great a peril can arise to the public security and to the welfare and very life of civil society itself, when such men are reduced to that condition of desperation that, having nothing which they fear to lose, they are emboldened to hope for chance advantage from the upheaval of the state and of the established order. Wherefore, those who have the care of the state and of the public good cannot neglect the needs of married people and their families, without bringing great harm upon the state and upon the common welfare. Hence, in making the laws and in disposing the public funds, they must do their utmost to relieve the needs of the poor, considering such a task as one of the most important of their administrative duties. We are sorry to note that not infrequently nowadays it happens that through a certain inversion of the true order of things, ready and bountiful assistance is provided for the unmarried mother and her illegitimate offspring, who of course must be helped in order to avoid a greater evil, which is denied to legitimate mothers, or given sparingly, or almost grudgingly. But not only in regard to temporal goods, venerable brethren, it is the concern of the public authority to make proper provision for matrimony and the family, but also in other things which concern the good of souls. Just laws must be made for the protection of chastity, for reciprocal conjugal aid, and for similar purposes, and these must be faithfully enforced, because, as history testifies, the prosperity of the state and the temporal happiness of its citizens cannot remain safe and sound where the official foundation on which they are established, which is the moral order, is weakened, and where the very fountainhead from which the state draws its life, namely wedlock and the family, is obstructed by the vices of its citizens. For the preservation of the moral order, neither the laws and sanctions of the temporal power are sufficient, nor is the beauty of virtue and the expounding of its necessity. Religious authority must enter to enlighten the mind, to direct the will, and to strengthen human frailty by the assistance of divine grace. Such an authority is found nowhere save in the Church instituted by Christ the Lord. Hence we earnestly exhort in the Lord all those who hold the reins of power that they establish and maintain firmly harmony and friendship with this Church of Christ, so that through the united activity and energy of both powers, the tremendous evils, fruits of those wanton liberties which assail both marriage and the family, and are a menace to both church and state, may be effectively frustrated. Governments can assist the Church greatly in the execution of its important office, if, in laying down their ordinances, they take account of what is prescribed by divine and ecclesiastical law, and if penalties are fixed for offenders. For as it is, there are those who think that whatsoever is permitted by the laws of the state, or at least is not punished by them, is allowed also in the moral order, and, because they neither fear God nor see any reason to fear the laws of man, they act even against their conscience, thus often bringing ruin upon themselves and upon many others. There will be no peril or to lessening of the rights and integrity of the state from its association with the Church. Such suspicion and fear is empty and groundless, as Leo XIII had already set so clearly forth. It is generally agreed, he says, that the founder of the Church, Jesus Christ, wished the spiritual power to be distinct from the civil, and each to be free and unhampered in doing its own work, not forgetting, however, that it is expedient to both, and in the interest of everybody, that there will be a harmonious relationship. If the civil power combines in a friendly manner with the spiritual power of the Church, it necessarily follows that both parties will greatly benefit. The dignity of the state will be enhanced, and with religion as its guide, there will never be a rule that is not just, while for the Church there will be at hand a safeguard and defense which will operate to the public good of the faithful. To bring forward a recent and clear example of what is meant, it has happened quite in consonance with the right order and entirely according to the law of Christ, that in the solemn convention happily entered into between the Holy See and the Kingdom of Italy, also in matrimonial affairs a peaceful settlement and friendly cooperation has been obtained, such as befitted the glorious history of the Italian people and its ancient and sacred traditions. These decrees, which are to be found in the Lateran Pact, the Italian state, desirous of restoring to the institution of matrimony, which is the basis of the family, that dignity conformable to the traditions of its people, assigns as civil effects of the sacrament of matrimony all that is attributed to it in canon law. To this fundamental norm are added further clauses in the common pact. This might as well be a striking example to all of how, even in our own day, in which, sad to say, the absolute separation of the civil power from the Church, and indeed from every religion, is so often taught, the one supreme authority can be united and associated with the other without detriment to the rights and supreme power of either, thus protecting Christian parents from pernicious evils and menacing ruin. All of these things which, venerable brethren, prompted by our past solicitude, we put before you, we wish accordingly to be the norm of Christian prudence, to be promulgated widely among our beloved children committed to your care, as members of the great family of Christ, that all may be thoroughly acquainted with sound teaching concerning marriage, so that they may be ever on their guard against the dangers advocated by the teachers of error, and, most of all, that denying ungodliness and worldly desires, they may live soberly and justly and godly in this world, looking for the blessed hope and coming of the glory of the great God and our Savior Jesus Christ. May the Father, of whom all paternity in heaven and earth is named, who strengthens the weak and gives courage to the pusillanimous and faint-hearted, and Christ our Lord the Redeemer, the institutor and perfecter of the holy sacraments, who desired marriage to be, and made it the mystical image of his own ineffable union with the Church, and the Holy Ghost, the love of God, the light of hearts and the strength of the mind, grant that all will perceive, will admit with a ready will, and by the grace of God will be put into practice, that we by this letter have expounded concerning the holy sacrament of matrimony, the wonderful law and will of God respecting it, the errors and impending dangers, and the remedies with which they can be counteracted, so that that fruitfulness dedicated to God will flourish again vigorously in Christian wedlock. As we most humbly pour forth our earnest prayer at the throne of his grace, that God, the author of all graces, the inspirer of all good desires and deeds, may bring this about, and deign to give it abundantly, according to the greatness of his liberality and omnipotence, and as a token of the abundant blessings of the same omnipotent God, we lovingly grant to you, venerable brethren, and to the clergy and the people committed to your watchful care, an apostolic benediction. Given at Rome in St. Peter's, on the 31st day of December, in the year 1930, the 9th of our pontificate.